Imagine pain that cannot be numbed. No sleeping pills, no injections, no choices. Just a chair, just forceps. And the person across the room who says it's necessary. In the Victorian era, toothaches were not treated. They were pulled out. Just like a nail in a tree. Sometimes on the street. Sometimes in front of a crowd. Sometimes when the infection had already reached the brain, and time passed not by days, but by minutes. This is not a medical story. This is a story of survival. There's only one question. Could you endure it? Without screaming, without running away, without painkillers. Rooms where pain was evidence. The places where teeth were pulled rarely looked like they were healing. They weren't supposed to be soothing. They weren't supposed to inspire trust. Their job was simple: to endure the screams. They could be the back rooms of barbershops, the basements of pharmacies, the corners of hospitals where the light fell unevenly and the air was heavy with smells that could not be confused with anything else. Metal, old wood, blood that had soaked into the floor. The chair was almost never special. Often it was an ordinary high-backed chair. Sometimes it was a kitchen chair. Sometimes it was the same one that someone else had just sat on. It wasn't washed, it wasn't wiped, just pushed aside a little and invited the next one in. Here, they didn't ask if you were ready. Here, they asked if you could hold on. The toothpicks were in plain sight. This was intentional. They weren't hidden in drawers. They weren't wrapped in cloth. On the contrary, they were shown right away. The tools had to look convincing. Large, rough, heavy. Some of them looked more like carpenter's tools than a doctor's. And there was truth to that. They didn't treat the tooth. They pulled it out as an obstacle. The person was seated. Their shoulders were pressed against the back. Their head was held with their hands or a belt. Sometimes an assistant helped. Sometimes a random acquaintance. Sometimes no one. Because pain was considered a personal matter. Before starting, they could give them a sip of alcohol. Rum, gin, anything that could dull their consciousness a little. It wasn't anesthesia. It was a distraction. And then the forceps touched the tooth. The first touch was almost reassuring, as if nothing bad was going to happen, as if it was just metal on bone. But when the movement began, slow, with force, the body reacted before the mind. People didn't scream right away. At first, they held their breath. Eyes widened. Fingers clenched the wood as if they could break it. And only then, the sound. Loud, sharp, animal. It wasn't just pain. It was the feeling of something being torn out of the very head. Sometimes the tooth wouldn't budge. It broke. It stayed inside. Then the forceps went in again. Deeper, stronger. No one counted the attempts. No one stopped if the person lost control. Fainting did not mean the end. It meant that you could work faster. After that, no one guaranteed relief. The wound remained open. The blood flowed. Saliva mixed with the metallic taste of fear. The person was advised to press the cloth, go home, and hope. Because hope was the only thing that didn't cost money. But it was in these rooms that other stories began. The ones where the pain did not end. The ones where the infection found its way deeper. The ones where the extraction was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will see how the Victorian confidence in the power of metal collided with the fact that it was impossible to extract with forceps. Rooms where pain was evidence. The places where teeth were pulled rarely looked like they were healing. They weren't supposed to be soothing. They weren't supposed to inspire trust. Their job was simple: to endure the screams. They could be the back rooms of barbershops, the basements of pharmacies, the corners of hospitals where the light fell unevenly and the air was heavy with smells that could not be confused with anything else. Metal, old wood, blood that had soaked into the floor. The chair was almost never special. Often it was an ordinary high-backed chair. Sometimes it was a kitchen chair. Sometimes it was the same one that someone else had just sat on. It wasn't washed, it wasn't wiped, just pushed aside a little and invited the next one in. Here, they didn't ask if you were ready. Here, they asked if you could hold on. The toothpicks were in plain sight. This was intentional. They weren't hidden in drawers. They weren't wrapped in cloth. On the contrary, they were shown right away. The tools had to look convincing. Large, rough, heavy. Some of them looked more like carpenter's tools than a doctor's. And there was truth to that. They didn't treat the tooth. They pulled it out as an obstacle. The person was seated. Their shoulders were pressed against the back. Their head was held with their hands or a belt. Sometimes an assistant helped. Sometimes a random acquaintance. Sometimes no one. Because pain was considered a personal matter. Before starting, they could give them a sip of alcohol. Rum, gin, anything that could dull their consciousness a little. It wasn't anesthesia. It was a distraction. And then the forceps touched the tooth. The first touch was almost reassuring, as if nothing bad was going to happen, as if it was just metal on bone. But when the movement began, slow, with force, the body reacted before the mind. People didn't scream right away. At first, they held their breath. Eyes widened. Fingers clenched the wood as if they could break it. And only then, the sound. Loud, sharp, animal. It wasn't just pain. It was the feeling of something being torn out of the very head. Sometimes the tooth wouldn't budge. It broke. It stayed inside. Then the forceps went in again. Deeper, stronger. No one counted the attempts. No one stopped if the person lost control. Fainting did not mean the end. It meant that you could work faster. After that, no one guaranteed relief. The wound remained open. The blood flowed. Saliva mixed with the metallic taste of fear. The person was advised to press the cloth, go home, and hope, because hope was the only thing that didn't cost money. But it was in these rooms that other stories began. The ones where the pain did not end. The ones where the infection found its way deeper. The ones where the extraction was only the beginning. In the next chapter, we will see how the Victorian confidence in the power of metal collided with the fact that it was impossible to extract with forceps when metal doesn't save. After a tooth was removed, the pain sometimes subsided. It didn't disappear, but retreated like a predator that had taken a bite and retreated into the shadows. People took it as a victory, as a sign that the worst was behind it, that the metal had done its job. But the Victorian body lived by different rules, because not every pain came from a tooth, and not every wound wanted to heal. The empty space in the jaw remained open, without stitches, without disinfection, without understanding what was happening inside. The blood stopped, but the door remained ajar. Air came through them, food, dirt, microscopic things that at that time were not even suspected of their existence. Infection took its time. It was patient. First, there was swelling, slight. The person felt that their cheek had become heavier, that it was unpleasant to smile, that it hurt to touch. They ignored it, because ignoring it was part of everyday life. On the second or third day, warmth appeared. Not outside, but inside, as if a fire was smoldering in the bone. The pain changed. It no longer throbbed. It pressed. The pressure increased at night. The person woke up with the feeling that their head had become smaller than what was happening inside it. Some people smelled a smell, metallic, sweet, a smell that was not in the room, but that could not be gotten rid of. It was the smell of decay. And then what they feared most began, the change in their face. The cheek would swell. The eyes looked asymmetrical. The skin tightened, shone, became painfully sensitive. People tried to hide it. They wrapped their faces in scarves. They didn't leave the house. They spoke in whispers. Because a disease on the face is no longer just pain. It's visibility. And visibility in Victorian society was dangerous. When the temperature rose, fear came. Not sharp, slow. Fear that something had gone wrong, that they had pulled out the wrong thing, or pulled out too late. But there was nowhere to turn. The same people, the same tools, the same advice. Wait, apply a compress, endure a little more. Because the medicine of that time believed in one thing. If the body can't stand it, it's weak. And weakness was not treated, it was experienced. In some cases, the infection broke out. Pus found a way. The swelling went down, the pain decreased. It looked like a miracle, like salvation. But sometimes the way went up, through the sinuses, through the eye sockets, through bones that should not have been a barrier. People began to see double. The world became blurry. A ringing in the ears appeared. The head became heavy. Not from pain, from pressure from within. And then hallucinations came. The person spoke to those who were not there, answered questions that no one asked. She was held so that she would not fall, and at that moment everyone understood. Forceps would no longer help. Death from a tooth was not uncommon. She didn't look dramatic. She wasn't fast. She was quiet. The person faded away in bed, with a hot forehead, with heavy breathing, with a face that no longer belonged to her. And the worst part is, no one knew at what point everything became irreversible. There was no limit. There was no warning. Just one tooth, one pain, one wrong choice or belated decision. In the Victorian world, it wasn't the powerful who survived. It was the lucky ones. In the next chapter, we'll see how the fear of death gave rise to another phenomenon: public removals, showy procedures, and the hope that quick pain was better than slow fading. Better a quick pain than a slow death. Fear changes logic. In the Victorian world, people rarely asked if they were doing the right thing. They asked only one thing: if it was fast enough. After stories of swelling, delirium, and silent deaths in bed, toothache began to be perceived not as an illness, but as a harbinger, a sign that time had passed. That is when an idea appears that seems wild today, but seemed reasonable at the time. If pain is inevitable, it must be reduced. Public tooth extractions were the answer to fear. They happened quickly, noisily, in full view. Markets, plots, inns, places where people used to gather, now became places where pain was displayed. It was no show, at least not officially. It was an assurance. If you see how another endures, you believe that you can too. The person was brought forward. They sat down. Sometimes they were not even fixed. Time was the main argument. Faster meant better. The forceps grabbed the tooth without long preparations, without checks, without doubts. One jerk, sometimes two. The crowd held its breath, not out of sympathy, out of expectation. The scream was a signal that everything was going right. If the person screamed, it meant he was alive. If he screamed loudly, it meant the pain had not killed him. After, there was no applause, only movement. The crowd dispersed. Because in the Victorian world, pain did not deserve attention longer than it lasted. But publicity had another function. It removed responsibility. When the extraction took place in front of everyone, no one was to blame. Not the doctor, not the assistant, not the patient. It was the will of circumstances. And it was here that a figure appeared who would become a symbol of the era. A dentist without a diploma, but with a reputation. He was known for his hands, for his strength, for his speed. They said, "He pulls out in a second. He doesn't torture. After him, people survive." That was enough. He was trusted not because he knew anatomy, but because he didn't stop. There was a strange logic of survival in this. The less time the pain lasted, the less chance it would be fatal. But speed had a price. Teeth broke. The roots remained in the bone. Jaws cracked. Blood flowed more. The wounds were rougher. Infections were more aggressive. But people still chose it, because the alternative was worse. Waiting. Watching your face change. Feeling the pain slowly rise. Public removal gave the illusion of control, as if you were not a victim, but a participant. You got out. You sat down. You held on. But there were those who couldn't. People fainted before the first jolt. They fell. They hit each other. Sometimes they didn't get up. Then the crowd fell silent, not out of terror, out of discomfort, because death disrupted order, and order in Victorian Britain was more important than pain. It is at this point that dentistry ceases to be just a craft. It becomes a test of how much a person is willing to endure in order not to die later. In the next chapter, we will go deeper, into the moments when extraction ceases to be a choice and becomes a compulsion, where fear no longer leaves room for refusal, when refusal no longer exists. There is a moment when choice disappears, not because a person stops thinking, but because thoughts no longer matter. In the Victorian world, this moment often came quietly, without witnesses, without announcements. Simply, one day, the pain ceased to be local. It no longer lived in the tooth. It occupied the whole body. The person felt weakness in his legs. Hands trembled. The world lost its clarity. Work became impossible. Food became unattainable. Sleep became dangerous, because sleep meant loss of control. It was then that the decisions were made not by those who suffered, but by those who were nearby. The wife, the father, the foreman in the workshop, the landlord. They looked at the face that changed every day. They listened to the dreams at night. They counted the hours, and finally they said, "Enough." The person was led, sometimes by supporting, sometimes by pulling. She could cry, she could beg, she could be silent. It didn't matter anymore. In such cases, the dentist didn't ask questions. He had seen it before. A face that had already crossed the line. Eyes that didn't focus. A smell that left no doubt. This wasn't about treatment. This was about trying to stop the process. The person was seated. They were restrained. Sometimes belts were used, sometimes ropes, sometimes the hands of several men. This wasn't considered cruelty. This was considered necessity, because movement could cost a life, and screaming only made the pain louder. The forceps went into the mouth, which did not always open voluntarily. The teeth clenched. The jaws resisted. Then other instruments were used: wedges, hooks, anything that could open the mouth. And when the metal touched the infected tooth, the reaction was instant. The body arched. The eyes opened wide, as if trying to escape. The person could faint. They could vomit. They could suddenly fall silent. And it was the silence that was most frightening, because silence meant that the body had either surrendered or crossed the line. Sometimes the tooth was pulled out. Sometimes it was broken. Sometimes it was pulled out along with part of the bone. Blood was everywhere, on clothes, on hands, on the floor. But no one stopped, because stopping meant the pain would return, and the pain would return meant death. After the procedure, the person was not left in the chair. They carried her. They laid her down. They covered her up. She might not wake up right away. She might not wake up at all. And then they said it was too late, that the infection had gone too far, that they had done everything they could. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was an excuse. The scariest part was something else. Even when everything was successful, the person was no longer the same. The pain left its mark on the body, in the look, in the silence. People who had survived such removals rarely talked about them, because these were not stories of courage. They were stories of loss of control, about the moment when your body becomes a problem that someone else has to solve. In Victorian society, survival often meant agreeing to something that you didn't want. And this is where dentistry finally ceases to be medicine. It becomes part of a system where the body is a resource and pain is a tool. In the next chapter, we'll see how fear and lack of knowledge gave rise to belief in myths, rituals, and dangerous cures that promised to avoid the forceps. Promises without pain. When fear becomes constant, a person begins to look not for solutions, but for promises. In the Victorian era, pain was so commonplace that any suggestion of avoiding it seemed like a miracle, especially when it came to tweezers. That is why another world quickly emerges around toothache. Quier. Less formal, much more dangerous. A world of remedies that did not require a chair. Powders were sold on the streets, drops in newspapers, tinctures in pharmacies with soothing-sounding names. They promised something that no procedure could guarantee: painless relief. People wanted to believe, because faith did not cut gums. It did not break teeth. It did not attract attention. Opium tinctures, mixtures with morphine, alcoholic solutions with herbs. Some really reduced pain, temporarily, not for long. But reducing pain did not mean reducing the disease. On the contrary, the person began to postpone the visit, postpone the decision, postpone the fear. Meanwhile, the infection did not postpone anything. It moved slowly, methodically, without emotion. But in those moments when the tincture worked, hope appeared. Hope that it was possible to do without metal, without screaming, without humiliation. The so-called dental elixirs were especially popular. They were advertised as the result of science, as a new approach. as the future of medicine. The labels were beautiful. The texts were confident. The testimonies were convincing. No one wrote about side effects. No one mentioned addiction. No one talked about dosage. Because the main thing was one thing. You could avoid the forceps. People swallowed drops before going to bed. They gave them to children. They mixed them with tea. And for a few hours, the pain really disappeared. But in the morning, it returned. Deeper. Worse. Some began to increase the dose, looking for stronger remedies. Combining. Opium calmed, but it also erased boundaries. The person ceased to understand how serious everything had become. She smiled when she should have been afraid. The infection was doing its job at that time. There were other methods, much stranger. Applying metal, fumigation with herbs, lotions with vinegar and sulfur. Some believed that pain could be pulled out of the body, like evil, like poison. This seemed logical in an era where illness was perceived as something external. But toothaches didn't go away. They just hid. And when they did, they would come back with a vengeance. The most dangerous thing was that these remedies created an illusion of control. People thought that they were in control of the situation. In reality, they were only postponing the moment when there would be no choice. And when the forceps reappeared, the body was weaker. The infection was stronger. Time was lost. That's when dentists started saying a phrase that sounded like a sentence. We should have done this sooner. But earlier no longer existed. In the next chapter, we will see how belief in painless promises clashed with reality, and how the advent of the first attempts at anesthesia changed not only dentistry, but also the very concept of pain. When pain was tried to be turned off, the idea of pain relief did not appear as charity. It appeared as desperation. By the middle of the 19th century, it became clear: quick pain does not always save. Alcohol does not help. Promises kill. There were too many deaths to be attributed to chance. It was then that medicine took a step that would change everything, and at the same time open up new dangers. The first attempts at anesthesia looked almost like a trick. Gas, vapors, smells that caused laughter or dizziness, ether, nitrous oxide. They were not understood. They were not measured. They were tested. A person was seated in a chair. A mask or cloth was held up to his face. He was asked to inhale. Someone started laughing. Someone started crying. Someone suddenly fell silent. And only then did the dentist act. Without screaming, without jerking, without resistance. It looked like a miracle. Newspapers wrote about the end of pain, about a new era, about humanity. But reality was more complicated. The doses were unknown. Reactions were unpredictable. The line between anesthesia and respiratory arrest was thin. Some did not wake up. Dentistry once again found itself between two fears: pain or death, screaming or silence. Sometimes anesthesia worked too well. A person lost control of his body. Reflexes disappeared. Blood entered the respiratory tract. The tongue sank. Breathing became shallow. The dentist did not always notice this immediately. He was focused on the tooth, on the instrument, on the speed. And when he did notice, it was too late. Thus, a new fear appeared, not of pain, but of losing consciousness. Some patients refused the gas. They said, "It was better to feel. It was better to hear yourself. It was better to scream." Because screaming meant that you were alive. But there were also those who agreed, especially those who already knew what forceps were. They chose the risk, because any risk was better than repetition. Dentists found themselves in a new role. They were no longer just those who inflicted pain. They became those who controlled consciousness. And this power was frightening. Mistakes happened. They were spoken of in whispers. They were not advertised. But each such story undermined trust. And society again wavered between two extremes: cruelty without pain, and mercy with the risk of death. Anesthesia did not solve the problem. It only changed its form. Pain was no longer the only enemy. Added to it was the fear of not waking up. In the next chapter, we will see how this fear changed the very image of the dentist, from a man with forceps to a man who was trusted with life, and what happened when this trust was broken. The person you entrust your consciousness to, trust, is silence. Not the silence that comes after a scream, but the silence in which a person allows another to approach him without resistance. In Victorian dentistry, this silence was new, unusual, dangerous. When anesthesia appeared, the patient ceased to be a participant in the procedure for the first time. He no longer squeezed the armrests. He did not track the movements of the forceps. He did not control his own body. He gave it away. And at that moment, the dentist ceased to be just a craftsman. He became a person who was entrusted with his life for a few minutes. Not everyone was ready for this role. Many of those who had been pulling teeth in the markets yesterday now received new power into their hands. Power over breathing, over the heart, over the moment of return. There was almost no formal training. Rules, too. They learned by doing, on other people's bodies, on mistakes that could not always be corrected. The patient was seated. The mask was raised to the face. They were told to breathe deeper. The eyes slowly closed. The muscles relaxed. The world receded. And this was where the danger arose that had not existed before. Because an unconscious person could not say that he was sick. He could not show fear. He could not stop the process. If breathing became slower, it might not be noticed. If the heart got out of rhythm, it was attributed to the gas. Sometimes the patient would wake up with a feeling that something was wrong, with chest pain, with a foggy head. Sometimes he wouldn't wake up at all. Such cases were spoken of in whispers. They were called unsuccessful reactions, individual sensitivity. No one was looking for the guilty, because progress was to blame. But trust began to crack. People began to ask, "Who is this person? Does he know what he is doing? Will I wake up?" Dentistry encountered ethics for the first time, not on paper, but in attitudes. Some doctors refused gas, returning to old methods. Others, on the contrary, sought to improve control. Clocks appeared. The seconds were counted. They listened to the breathing, slowly, painfully, because of the losses. But even under conditions of caution, the fear remained. Because what is scarier, to feel pain or not to feel anything? The patients began to bargain. A little gas. Not completely. I want to hear. They were looking for the line between consciousness and salvation, a line that no one could clearly draw. And this is where the turning point occurs. Dentistry is no longer associated only with pain. It begins to be associated with risk. The risk of trust. The risk of silence. The risk of giving yourself to a person whom you hardly know. In the next chapter, we will see how these fears have moved beyond the confines of clinics and become part of public stories, scandals, and incidents that have made people ask again, does progress really save, or does it simply change the way we risk our lives? When a city begins to whisper. Cities rarely scream at once. They start with a whisper. In Victorian London, rumors traveled faster than newspapers. They were passed on in queues, on trams, in workshops, by the bedsides of the sick. He didn't wake up. They say the gas was too strong. A woman went in to have a tooth extracted and never came back. Such stories had no names. That's why they were dangerous. Because without names, fear becomes universal. Dentistry, which only yesterday seemed like a symbol of progress, began to be associated with a risk that was impossible to calculate. At first, newspapers were silent. Then they wrote cautiously, briefly, without details. The words were chosen so as not to cause panic, but people read between the lines. If they mention sudden weakness, it means something went wrong. If they write natural causes, it means they don't know them. A few cases became public, especially when it came to children, or women from respectable families. Then the question sounded different. Is it safe at all? Dentists began to defend themselves. They wrote letters. They published explanations. They talked about the inevitable risks of progress. But words lost to experience. People remembered the scream. They remembered the blood. They remembered fainting. And now another memory was added, of the silence, from which they never return. Trust wavered. Some returned to old methods, better pain than the unknown. Others looked for reliable dentists, those who were not talked about, those who no one has died yet. It was a strange criterion, but at the time it was logical. Lists appeared, recommendations, warnings. The city itself tried to create rules because there were not enough official ones. In this chaos, scammers also appeared, those who took advantage of fear. They promised safe gas, soft anesthesia, new formulas, and again, no guarantees. People were faced with a familiar choice, but now it was more difficult. To scream or to remain silent. To be conscious or to risk it. The dental chair turned into a place of moral choice. And this choice ceased to be personal. It became social. For each story quickly became the story of the city, and the city began to change. It demanded answers, control, explanations. What began as an attempt to silence the pain led to a much broader question. Who is responsible when progress goes wrong? In the next chapter, we will see how these questions led to the first attempts at regulation, and how the state, for the first time, looked into the dentist's chair. When the state sits next to the chair. When fear becomes communal, it takes on a form. In Victorian Britain, that form was the state, not out of charity, not out of concern, but out of necessity. Too many stories, too much silence after procedures, too many unanswered questions. And then, for the first time, a game-changing idea emerges. Pain is no longer a private matter. If people die, it is no longer their choice. It is a problem of order. Inspections appear, commissions, reports. They did not look for sympathy. They looked for reasons. Who was allowed to work? What tools are allowed? How much gas is safe? The questions sounded cold, mechanical, but for many, they were more frightening than forceps, because control meant the end of the usual freedom. Dentists who had worked without supervision for years now had to explain themselves. Write. Prove. Some couldn't. Their methods didn't stand the light. Their stories didn't make it into reports. They disappeared from the city as quietly as their patients did. Others adapted. They learned new rules. They agreed to restrictions. The first licenses appeared. Imperfect. Imperfect. But they changed the feeling. The dental chair was no longer a place of absolute power for the doctor. An invisible observer appeared next to him. Laws didn't take away fear, they only regulated it. Now, risk had instructions. Pain was a procedure, and death was an explanation. And that was no less frightening. Patients began to believe that if something went wrong, it would be someone else's fault. But believing in the culprits did not save them from the consequences. Anesthesia was still dangerous. Infections were common. Errors were inevitable. The difference was that now they were written about. Death ceased to be a whisper. It became a point in a report. And this is where the romance of progress disappeared. Instead of promises, there were numbers. Instead of miracles, there were statistics. Instead of hope, there were acceptable risks. The person in the chair was no longer a story. He was an accident. And yet for many, it was a relief, because when pain is regulated, it seems less random. But others were paid for the control. Trust became formal. Procedures are colder. Human contact is shorter. The dentist looked at his watch, at the dosage, at the instructions, and less at his face. In the next chapter, we will see what happens when the pain becomes controlled but does not disappear, and how people who survived the old dentistry looked at the new without joy, only with memory. Those who remembered pain. Progress does not erase memory. It only adds a new layer to it. In Victorian Britain, dentistry at the end of the century already looked different. There were rules. There were diplomas. There were instructions. The chair became cleaner. The instruments were ordered. The gas was metered. But people did not change so quickly. Those who survived the old dentistry came to the new one with a body that remembered. They would sit in the chair, and their hands would start to tremble even before they touched it. Their hearts would race even before they spoke. Their breath would become short, as if their body was preparing to flee. Rationally, they knew. Now it was different. Now it was safer. Now it was under control. But rationality does not live in the jaw. Pain leaves traces where words don't. Dentists were starting to notice. People who begged not to use gas. People who asked to see everything. People who wanted to count the seconds. They didn't trust silence. because silence used to mean either the end of pain or the end of life. It was especially hard for those who had seen deaths of brothers, of wives, of children, of one tooth, of one procedure, of one mistake, and lives were changed forever. Such people said little. They didn't write letters of no complaints. They simply didn't come. Of suffering, of procrastination, of going back to old habits. Because even a controlled risk is still a risk if you've already paid the price. The younger generations were different. They didn't remember the screams in the squares. They didn't see the tongs without gloves. They didn't hear the stories of infections that rose to the brain. For them, dentistry was discomfort, not a sentence. And this is where the gap arises. Two realities in one city. Two ways of looking at the same chair. One as a threat, the other as a procedure. Society moved on, but memory didn't. And this memory didn't live in archives. It lived in bodies, in the tension of jaws, in clenched fingers, in the reluctance to close their eyes. The new generation of dentists learned to work with this, not just with teeth, but with experience. They spoke more slowly. They explained more. They left the lights on, because sometimes light is the only thing that separates salvation from fear. But even with all the changes, the question remained. Had we truly conquered the pain, or had we just learned to bury it deeper? Because when something went wrong, the old stories would come back, not as memories, as warnings. The price paid for silence. When pain goes away, it is not always noticed. Dentistry did indeed become quieter in the late Victorian era. Less screaming, less blood on the floor, fewer crowds gathering around the chair. On the surface, it looked like a victory. But silence does not mean the absence of fear. It only means that fear has learned to be silent. Those who survived the old dentistry knew the true cost of this progress. They remembered that every tool came not from an idea, but from defeat, from pain, from death. Every rule is someone's story that ended too soon. Every instruction is the mark of a mistake that they did not want to repeat again. The dental chair became a symbol of something more than treatment. It became a symbol of compromise. A compromise between suffering and risk, between control and trust, between the desire to live and the fear of how exactly you will have to survive. The Victorian man did not ask, "Will it hurt?" He asked, "Will I survive this?" And the answer was never guaranteed. That is why this story is not about teeth, and not about doctors. It is about the line that a person is willing to cross when pain becomes life-threatening. About the moment when you agree to the forceps, to the gas, to the risk, because the alternative is slow fading. Today we look at Victorian dentistry with amazement, sometimes with horror, sometimes with irony. But it is important to remember, these people were not cruel. They were defenseless. They made choices in a world where pain was the norm and knowledge was limited. Their bodies became the field of experimentation that today allows us to stop thinking of pain as a sentence. But every silence we have now is built on someone's screams in the past. And that's what makes the story of survival honest. Because survival isn't always a victory. And it's not always a triumph. Sometimes it's just the fact that you woke up after a procedure. sometimes it's not. So the next time you sit in a chair and the light above you comes on, remember, once upon a time, that light didn't mean hope, it meant risk. And ask yourself the same question that people asked themselves 150 years ago. Would you have survived this if you'd been born then? If you've listened to this far, then you've made it. Not everyone could. In this channel, we return to stories where survival was not guaranteed. Real people, real pain, real decisions. If you want to hear the next story, stay with us. Subscribe, and let the silence this time mean peace.